My husband demanded I sign my house over to him, so I handed him divorce papers instead. A month ago, if anyone had asked whether I trusted my husband, I would have answered without hesitation. I would have smiled and said yes because I truly believed we were building the same future. What I didn't understand then was that trust rarely shatters in a single moment. It fades so quietly that you don't notice it's disappearing until you realize the life you've been living has become someone else's carefully rehearsed performance. I built my landscaping company from nothing. In the beginning, all I had was an old pickup that barely started and a second-hand lawnmower my uncle loaned me because buying one myself wasn't an option. I spent years loading equipment before sunrise, chasing every contract I could find, hoping each season would earn enough to carry me into the next. Today, 14 employees rely on the business, and 3 years ago, I finally paid off the house in full. It isn't a mansion, but every room represents years of sacrifice, long hours, and dreams I refuse to abandon. Ethan used to tell everyone how proud he was of me. At least, that's what he wanted me to believe. We never had children because Ethan never wanted them. I spent the first few years hoping he'd eventually change his mind, but after enough difficult conversations, I accepted that some dreams weren't meant to be shared. So I poured everything I had into our marriage and the life we were building together. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I was trying to fill the space where the family I'd imagined should have been. The warning signs didn't arrive as dramatic fights or obvious betrayals. They came disguised as harmless observations and questions that sounded almost casual. "You know," Ethan said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, "it's strange that everything belongs to you." I glanced up from the sink. "What do you mean?" "The business, the savings, the house." "We're married," I replied. "Everything I have supports both of us." "I know," he said with a faint smile, but something in his expression told me he wasn't satisfied. That conversation didn't end there. Over the next few months, it resurfaced again and again while we watched television, drove across town, or got ready for bed. Ethan often joked that he felt more like a guest than a husband, so I offered practical solutions. "If you want easier access to our accounts, we can change everything tomorrow." He always gave the same answer. "It's too complicated." At the time, I believed him. Looking back, I realized he was never asking for access. What he wanted was ownership. The night everything finally unraveled began like any other Tuesday. I'd just come home after a long day meeting commercial clients and was relaxing in the living room when the front door opened. Ethan walked in looking nothing like someone returning from book club. His pressed shirt, designer watch, expensive cologne, and spotless shoes made him look as though he'd spent the evening at an upscale rooftop bar instead. He stopped just inside the doorway. "We need to talk." Something in his voice made me mute the television immediately. "Okay," I said. He folded his arms, took a slow breath, and said, "I've been thinking about our future. I need security." "We already have security," I replied. "The mortgage has been paid off for years and the business is doing well." He slowly shook his head. "No, I mean real security. Everything important is in your name." That wasn't the first time I'd heard those words, but it was the first time they carried so much weight. "If something ever happened between us," he continued, "I'd walk away with nothing." "You wouldn't." "I could. We could fix that with estate planning." "I don't want estate planning," he replied without hesitation. Hein looked me straight in the eye. "I want you to sign the house over to me." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "The deed?" "Yes." "You want me to sign it over tonight?" He nodded. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped before I could stop it. The request was so outrageous my mind refused to accept he'd actually said it. "You want me to transfer the house I bought before we ever met, the house I paid off with money from my company, to you?" His jaw tightened. "I supported you for 12 years. I managed this house. You chose to stop working after leaving the boutique. My boss was impossible." "That was 8 years ago," I said. "You made that decision, not me." His expression hardened. "So that's what you think of me?" "I think this conversation doesn't make sense." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the hallway, and only then did I notice the 2 large suitcases standing neatly beside the front door. They were already packed, already waiting. In that instant, an unexpected calm settled over me because those bags hadn't been packed after this conversation began. They'd been packed long before he walked through the door. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a carefully rehearsed plan. "If you won't sign it," he said quietly, resting a hand on one of the suitcases, "I'm leaving tonight. Once the divorce starts, I'll take my share anyway." Han expected me to panic, argue, or beg him to stay. Instead, I studied him for several seconds before nodding once. "All right." His shoulders relaxed immediately. "So you'll do it?" "I just need a pen." At last, he smiled. It wasn't relief. It was the satisfied smile of someone convinced he'd already won. I walked to my home office, but instead of reaching for a pen, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. The thick manila folder inside had been waiting there for 3 weeks, and I'd opened it so many times that I could almost picture every photograph without looking. When I returned, Ethan already had his phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen as though he couldn't wait to send someone good news. Without a word, I placed the folder in front of him. There you go. He opened it confidently, but the confidence vanished almost instantly. The first page wasn't a property transfer. It was a petition for divorce, followed by 42 pages compiled by a licensed private investigator. The report documented his affair with Olivia through photographs, financial records, surveillance logs, and everything else needed to leave no room for denial. The colour drained from his face as he turned the pages. His lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. His fingers tightened around the folder until the paper bent beneath his grip, and when he finally looked up, he stared at me as though the room itself had betrayed him. How? The word was barely audible. I had imagined this confrontation dozens of times over the previous 3 weeks. I'd pictured myself yelling, crying, demanding answers. Instead, all I felt was exhausted. The better question, I said quietly, is why? He flipped to another page. There were photographs of him and Olivia leaving a boutique hotel, sharing dinner on a restaurant patio, and walking into her apartment building late at night. Every image was stamped with the same details: the date, the time, and the location. There was nothing left to explain away. His voice cracked. You've been spying on me. I hired someone after your stories stopped making sense. My stories? You've been reading the same novel at your so-called book club for almost 4 months, I replied. The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is barely 400 pages, yet somehow your group was still discussing it after 16 weeks. His expression froze. I figured your club had either discovered the slowest reading pace in history. I tapped the folder lightly. Or book club wasn't where you were spending your evenings. He lowered his eyes to the report. The investigator had documented nearly everything, from hotel reservations and restaurant receipts to parking records, overnight visits to Olivia's apartment, and timestamps that matched every excuse he'd ever given me. I can explain. I shook my head. No, Ethan, you can't explain 14 months. He froze. You thought I only knew about the last few months? He swallowed hard, and before he said a word, I already had my answer. The investigation goes back 14 months. He slowly turned another page. Olivia was laughing while he carried shopping bags outside designer stores. There were receipts for jewellery, photographs from a weekend resort, credit card statements, cash withdrawals, and highlighted transactions that mapped out the affair almost day by day. His breathing grew uneven. You went through our finances. I had to. You invaded my privacy. A quiet laugh escaped before I could stop it. After more than a year of lies, hearing him complain about privacy sounded almost absurd. I was protecting myself. You didn't trust me. I trusted you for 12 years, I said, holding his gaze. I only stopped when you gave me a reason not to. His shoulders slumped. For the first time that evening, he looked less angry than frightened. I never wanted this. I let out a humorless laugh. No? He stared at the floor. It just happened. I'd heard that excuse before. People who cheated always acted as though betrayal appeared out of nowhere, as if hundreds of deliberate choices had somehow made themselves. Without responding, I opened the folder to another photograph. It showed his car parked outside Olivia's apartment overnight. Not once, but 6 different times over several weeks. You packed your suitcases before coming home tonight. He only stared back at me. The investigator photographed Olivia helping move furniture into her apartment last weekend. His head snapped up. How did you? You were planning to move in with her tonight. He didn't answer, and he didn't have to. Between the apartment lease, the moving schedule, and the packed suitcases waiting by the door, everything had already been arranged. The only part of his plan that hadn't gone the way he expected was me. I wasn't trying to hurt you. No. I nodded toward the suitcases. You were trying to leave with my house first. He covered his face with both hands. The only sound in the room was the rain tapping softly against the windows. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. Once seeing him cry would have broken me. For years, every argument ended the same way. Ethan cried, and somehow I was the one apologizing, even when I had done nothing wrong. It took me far too long to realize I'd mistaken guilt for love. Now all I saw was a man grieving the collapse of a plan that had already failed. I gave you 12 years, he whispered. You gave me 12 years, I replied quietly, and at least 14 months of lies. He closed his eyes. I was lonely. If you were lonely, you could have talked to me. You were always working. So you found someone else? I never meant for it to go this far. But it did. You stopped coming home early. I was building the business that paid for this house, I said. While I was working for our future, you were building another one. I had no response. For a moment, I wondered whether he'd rehearsed those excuses with Olivia, the same way he'd rehearsed tonight's ultimatum. Had they laughed together while imagining me signing over the deed? Had they already decided where the furniture would go? Those questions hurt more than any photograph, because the report only showed where he'd been. My imagination filled in everything it couldn't capture. I finally stood. You should go. I looked around the room as though seeing it for the first time. Our home. My home. Claire? The deed hasn't changed. His expression hardened again. I'll fight you. I expect you will. I'll hire the best attorney I can find. You should. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. Cool evening air drifted into the house. Take your bags. I didn't move. I said, take your bags. Without another word, he picked up both suitcases. At the doorway, he stopped, still facing away from me. You're going to regret this. I simply watched him walk out without answering. The man who would have been devastated to lose Ethan had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, the night I sat alone in my truck staring at the investigator's first email. That was when my marriage truly ended. Tonight wasn't the beginning of anything. It was simply the night Ethan finally realized it. After the front door closed behind him, I turned the deadbolt and listened to the lock click into place. Then I walked back into the living room, sat on the couch we'd picked out together, and stared at the dark television. 12 years of marriage had collapsed into a single folder, one impossible ultimatum, and 2 packed suitcases waiting by the door. What Ethan never understood was that I had stopped fighting the moment Rachel Morrison looked across her desk and gave me one simple instruction. Don't let him know what you know, let him keep believing he's in control. She explained that the moment he realized I discovered the affair, he'd start deleting messages, moving money, changing passwords, and rewriting the story in his favor. People who believe they're winning become careless, and careless people reveal far more than they ever intend. She was right. The hardest part wasn't discovering Ethan's affair. It was pretending I knew nothing. Every morning I poured his coffee. Every evening I asked how his day had gone. Every Tuesday he kissed my cheek before leaving for what he still called book club, and I'd smile, tell him to enjoy himself, then wait for his car to disappear before opening another email from the investigator. Each report hurt more than the last. First came evidence of rooftop dinners, then furniture shopping, and finally pictures of Ethan carrying decorative boxes into Olivia's apartment. That was when I realized she wasn't just an affair. They were building a home and a future that no longer included me. More than once, I nearly walked into the house and confronted him. The closest I came was the night I received the investigator's first report. I sat in my truck outside our home with the engine still running, gripping the steering wheel while the photographs glowed on my phone. Part of me wanted to throw every picture onto the kitchen table and demand an explanation for all the lies. Instead, I called Rachel. I can't keep pretending, I told her. You have to. I don't know if I can. You can, she replied calmly. Right now, he thinks he's ahead of you. Let him keep believing that. Her advice became the reason the investigation succeeded. Ethan never suspected anyone was watching, so he stopped being careful. He held Olivia's hand in public, paid for expensive dinners without hesitation, kissed her goodbye outside her apartment in broad daylight, and carried himself like a man who had already escaped his marriage. Then one Friday afternoon, the investigator called instead of emailing. I think you'll want this immediately. What happened? Their apartment shopping. I closed my office door before asking, together? Yes, they visited 3 properties today. The investigator's email arrived minutes later. Ethan and Olivia stood in an empty apartment while a leasing agent described the rooms. In the final picture, Ethan had pulled a tape measure from his jacket and was measuring one of the walls. I stared at that image longer than any other because people don't measure walls unless they're deciding where the furniture will go. In that moment, every lingering doubt disappeared. He wasn't confused, trapped, or trying to save our marriage. He had already begun replacing it. Even after seeing those photographs, I went home every evening and acted as though nothing had changed. It was exhausting. Ethan would sit beside me watching television, glance down whenever his phone buzzed and hide a faint smile before slipping it back into his pocket, never realizing I already knew exactly who was waiting on the other end. He'd glance at the screen whenever his phone buzzed, hide a faint smile, then lock it again before I could see the message. Everything okay? I'd ask. Just one of the guys. I figured. Those lies became part of our daily routine, and somehow that hurt more than a dramatic confession because it showed how natural deception had become for him. 3 days before the confrontation, the investigator delivered the final report. It was 42 pages documenting hotel stays, receipts, surveillance logs, and photographs of Ethan with Olivia. Rachel flipped through the binder inside her office. This is thorough. I wish it weren't. She looked at me for a moment. Are you ready? I don't know. You don't have to be emotionally ready, she said. You only need to be legally ready. She explained that the house was straightforward because I'd purchased it before the marriage and paid it off with my own funds. The business was different. Since it had grown during the marriage, Ethan would likely be entitled to part of its increased value. I've already accepted that, I said. Rachel nodded. But the affair affects other issues. What about spousal support? She let out a quiet sigh. 12 years is a long marriage, and he hasn't worked in years. Unfortunately, our state doesn't punish infidelity the way most people think it does. So I could end up supporting the man who cheated on me? It's possible. The money wasn't what hurt. It was the thought that someone who had secretly planned to replace me might still benefit from everything I'd spent years building. Before closing the folder, Rachel offered one final piece of advice. When you confront him, make sure he chooses to leave on his own. If he walks out voluntarily, it becomes much harder later for anyone to claim you forced him from the house. Remembering the 2 packed suitcases by the front door, I realized Ethan had unknowingly handed me exactly that protection. 2 days before everything fell apart, I came home early after a client cancelled. Ethan was sitting on the patio with his phone on the table when a message flashed across the screen before it locked. Can't wait until Tuesday. Everything's finally coming together. Olivia. He snatched up the phone almost immediately. You startled me. Sorry. I thought you were working late. The meeting was cancelled. For only a second, disappointment crossed his face. It wasn't guilt. It was the expression of someone whose plans had just been interrupted, and that brief reaction told me more than any confession ever could. By the time Tuesday arrived, I wasn't wondering whether Ethan would leave. I was wondering if he'd tell me the truth before I showed him I'd already uncovered every lie he'd been living. He never did. Instead, he walked through the front door carrying an ultimatum he believed would force my hand, never realizing I'd been quietly preparing for that moment for 21 days. 4 weeks later, we met again inside a mediation room on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse. The plain conference room, with its grey walls, long oak table, fluorescent lights, and untouched coffee pot in the corner, felt strangely ordinary for the place where 12 years of marriage would finally be reduced to paperwork and numbers. Rachel arrived 10 minutes early and placed 2 thick binders in front of me. One contained our financial records. The other held the investigator's report. You doing okay? She asked. I slept. That's not what I asked. A faint smile crossed my face. I'll get through today. She nodded. That's all you need. A few minutes later, Ethan walked in with his attorney. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, his tailored suit hung more loosely than before, and the confidence he always carried had vanished. He avoided my eyes as he sat across from me, although he was still wearing his wedding ring. I couldn't tell whether that had been his choice or another strategy suggested by his lawyer. The mediator arrived moments later, introduced herself, outlined the process, and reminded us that mediation was meant to find common ground rather than declare winners or losers. No one at the table seemed to believe that. Ethan's attorney spoke first. My client has experienced significant emotional distress since being forced to leave the marital residence. Rachel calmly opened one of her binders. My client forced no one to leave. Mr. Walker arrived with 2 packed suitcases before demanding ownership of a home that legally belonged to her. The mediator looked up. He already had his bags packed. Rachel slid a photograph across the table showing the suitcases waiting beside the front door. The evidence indicates he intended to relocate that evening, regardless of my client's response. The room fell noticeably quieter. Ethan lowered his eyes, but his attorney pressed on. My client contributed to maintaining the household throughout the marriage, and maintained a 14-month relationship with another woman, Rachel replied evenly. The mediator raised a hand. Let's separate the emotional issues from the property issues. Of course, Rachel said, before handing over the ownership records. Ms. Bennett purchased the residence 3 years before the marriage with separate funds, and the mortgage was paid entirely through business income that originated before the marriage. The mediator reviewed the documents carefully before looking toward Ethan's attorney. Based on these records, ownership of the residence appears fairly straightforward. We're not disputing title, he replied. We're arguing marital contribution. Rachel had anticipated that point. My client recognizes that the landscaping business increased in value during the marriage, and we're prepared to negotiate that issue. The residence, however, is not part of that discussion. The conversation shifted to the business, its financial history, and its current valuation, listening to strangers dissect the company. I'd spent nearly 20 years building one customer at a time felt strangely unreal. Ethan's attorney leaned forward again. My client sacrificed his own earning potential to support Ms. Bennett's career. Rachel remained composed. He voluntarily left a part-time retail position 8 years ago. He managed the household. So have countless spouses, Rachel replied as she opened the second binder. We also have evidence that during the final 14 months of the marriage, Mr. Walker diverted marital funds to support an ongoing extramarital relationship. She slid the investigator's report across the table. The mediator read through it in silence, page after page of hotel receipts, restaurant bills, photographs, cash withdrawals, gift purchases, and apartment visits. Together they told the story of something far more deliberate than a single mistake. They documented a carefully maintained second life. About 20 minutes later, the mediator looked at Ethan. Would you like to respond? He drew a slow breath. I made mistakes. Neither Rachel nor I interrupted. I wasn't trying to destroy our marriage. That morning, I met his eyes. No? His expression tightened. I was unhappy. You never told me. I didn't know how. But you knew how to rent an apartment with Olivia, spend our money on another relationship, and plan moving day. He lowered his eyes. His attorney rested a hand on his forearm, silently warning him not to answer. The mediator turned another page. The apartment lease was signed before the confrontation. According to the investigator, yes, Rachel replied. She looked directly at Ethan. Were you planning to move there the same evening you demanded ownership of the residence? He sat in silence for several seconds before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. Yes. The admission settled over the room without a single raised voice. No one reacted dramatically because the truth rarely needed help once it was spoken aloud. The rest of the afternoon dissolved into hours of financial negotiations. Every argument was met with documentation instead of emotion. During a short break, Rachel and I stepped into the hallway. I leaned against the wall, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up with me. I hate this. I know, Rachel said quietly. I want him to answer for what he did, but it still doesn't feel like enough. He already is, she replied. The question is whether making him suffer longer will actually help you. Rachel glanced toward the conference room door. If this goes to trial, you could spend another year trapped inside this marriage. Trials are expensive, unpredictable, and even strong evidence doesn't guarantee the outcome you're hoping for. I lowered my eyes. So what do I do? Rachel didn't answer immediately. After a brief silence, she finally said, You have to decide whether you're fighting for justice or whether you're still fighting because you're angry. Her words stayed with me because she was right. I was still angry, not enough to sacrifice my future, but enough to keep dragging my past into every decision. When we returned to the conference room, the real negotiations began. 4 exhausting hours later, both attorneys finally looked toward us. It was time to decide whether 12 years of marriage would end that afternoon or continue for another year inside a courtroom. Somewhere during those hours, something inside me had shifted. The pain hadn't disappeared, and I still couldn't understand how the man I trusted for 12 years had quietly built another life behind my back. But I no longer needed to see him suffer. I simply wanted my future back. The mediator looked around the table before breaking the silence. I believe everyone understands the risks of taking this to trial. Neither attorney disagreed. Rachel slid a revised settlement proposal across the table. We're prepared to resolve everything today. Ethan's attorney reviewed the document before handing it to his client. Ethan read each page slowly while the room remained silent except for the soft rustle of paper. After several minutes, his attorney finally looked up. We have concerns. I'm sure you do, Rachel replied calmly. But these numbers reflect both the law and the evidence. Negotiations resumed with the house, and Ethan's attorney made one final attempt. My client lived there for 12 years. Regardless of who purchased it, it became the marital residence. Rachel had expected the argument. She calmly placed another document on the table. The deed was recorded 3 years before the marriage, and the mortgage was paid entirely with Ms. Bennett's separate business income. The mediator reviewed the records, then looked up. I don't believe the residence is realistically subject to division. That issue ended almost immediately. By then, I saw genuine disappointment cross Ethan's face. It wasn't grief over losing our marriage. It was the realization that the house he'd expected to claim was never going to be his. The discussion then shifted to my business, which Rachel had warned would be the real point of contention. Ownership had never been in question, but the increase in value during the marriage was. After nearly an hour of negotiations, both sides settled on a figure. Ethan would receive 20% of the company's appreciation, paid over 4 years. Seeing that number on paper made my stomach tighten. Rachel leaned closer. If this goes to trial, a judge could award him more. I know. This isn't about what's fair, it's about reducing uncertainty. She was right. Sometimes winning isn't getting everything you want. It's avoiding a far worse outcome. Spousal support became the next issue. Ethan requested long-term payments, arguing that he'd managed the household after leaving the workforce. Rachel countered that he'd voluntarily stopped working 8 years earlier and had every opportunity to return to employment. After reviewing both positions, the mediator concluded that transitional support was appropriate. The final agreement required me to pay $2,100 a month for 3 years. There would be no permanent support, only enough time for both of us to rebuild separate lives. Neither of us looked satisfied, which probably meant the compromise had done exactly what compromises usually do. The remaining issues moved quickly. Ethan kept the sedan I'd purchased years earlier. We each retained our own bank accounts, and the furniture already removed stayed with him. The investigator's financial analysis became important one last time, documenting more than $8,000 in cash advances, hotel stays, restaurant bills, and luxury gifts that had financed his relationship with Olivia. Rachel summarized the evidence simply. Those expenditures should be treated as an advance distribution of marital assets. The mediator agreed, deducting the full amount from Ethan's settlement. His attorney objected briefly before realizing there was little left to challenge. Only one issue remained. My client requests that the investigator's report be sealed, his attorney said. We object, Rachel answered immediately. The report isn't simply embarrassing, it's the evidence that shaped every settlement reached today. After reviewing both arguments, the mediator closed the binder. The report will remain part of the record. I didn't feel victorious. I simply watched Ethan lower his eyes, knowing the lies he'd spent months protecting now existed permanently in black ink, supported by dates, signatures, and documentation. The final paperwork took another 20 minutes. There were no dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations, only quiet signatures ending 12 years of marriage. When I signed the last page, Rachel slid it toward the mediator. "It's done." I looked down at the pen in my hand and realized it was the same brand I'd almost handed Ethan the night he demanded my house. Back then, he thought I was about to sign away my future. Instead, I'd signed the end of a marriage that had already been over for weeks. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt almost blinding after hours beneath fluorescent lights. "You did well," Rachel said, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I don't feel like I won. You weren't supposed to. You survived." After she left, I headed toward my truck. I was almost there when I heard Ethan call my name. I turned to find him standing several feet away. Without the lawyers, paperwork, or mediator between us, he looked smaller than I remembered. "I just wanted to talk. I don't think there's anything left to say." "There is." He took a cautious step forward. "I know I hurt you." I didn't answer. I was lonely. You were always working. I was building our future. "I know." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You only know that now. You never asked me to slow down, never told me you were unhappy, never suggested counseling. You simply found Olivia." Hal rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't supposed to become serious. Yet you rented an apartment with her, and you packed your bags before you even came home that night." He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. His shoulders sagged. I panicked. "No," I held his gaze. "You planned." Silence settled between us before I asked the question that had been on my mind for weeks. "Where's Olivia?" His jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." "It isn't," I admitted with a small nod. "But I already know." Confusion flickered across his face. The investigator kept watching after our confrontation. His expression changed instantly. "The man who promised to build a new life with you." I paused. Walked away the moment his own divorce became real. He never denied it. He didn't have to. His face told me everything. Olivia was gone. The apartment they'd planned together no longer mattered, and the future he'd chosen over our marriage had collapsed before it ever began. "I've been staying with my parents," he admitted quietly. I remembered the confidence Ethan had the night he demanded my house. He'd walked through my front door convinced he was trading one life for a better one. Instead, he ended up back in his childhood bedroom, living out of boxes he'd never expected to unpack. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I'd imagined hearing those words for weeks, certain they would bring some kind of closure. Instead, they felt hollow. "I'm sure you are." When he called my name, I kept walking. Some apologies come too late, and some doors are never meant to reopen. The divorce became official 6 weeks later, without any dramatic sense of freedom. I spent the day answering emails, reviewing proposals, approving payroll, and doing the same work I'd always done. That's how most new beginnings arrive, not with celebration, but hidden inside ordinary days. The financial settlement was harder to accept than I expected. It wasn't the money that bothered me. It was knowing the end of a marriage rarely feels completely fair. Rachel had warned me, "Don't think of it as paying him. Think of it as buying back your future." She was right. Money could always be replaced. Time couldn't. As the months passed, the support payments became just another automatic transaction, and eventually I stopped checking the confirmation emails. The house changed too. Once Ethan was gone, I opened every window, packed away our wedding photographs, and repainted the bedroom walls that had always reminded me of our final argument. I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was simply making room for a future that no longer included it. The following weekend, my younger brother Daniel came over with pizza and helped me rearrange the furniture. After we finished, he looked around the living room and smiled. "It finally feels like your house." I looked around and realized he was right. Nothing expensive had changed, only the layout, the colors, and the memories attached to them. Somehow that was enough. Work quickly became my safest place. Without constant arguments or the quiet anxiety of wondering what waited at home, I found it easy to focus again. The business grew faster than I expected. We landed 2 major commercial maintenance contracts that summer, hired 3 new employees by autumn, and ended the year with the strongest financial results we'd ever seen. One afternoon, my operations manager laughed as she reviewed the quarterly reports. "You realize this is the best year this company has ever had?" I looked at the numbers before admitting I hadn't. "You've been smiling more too." That surprised me just as much. Only then did I realize I'd finally started healing. Not everyone moved on so easily. Ethan's family certainly didn't. His mother left angry voicemails blaming me for ruining his life. His sister insisted I should have forgiven one mistake, and his brother even showed up outside my office before leaving after noticing the security cameras above the entrance. I blocked every phone number, email address, and social media account. Not out of anger, but because peace sometimes means refusing to reopen doors that should stay closed. My family never questioned my decision. My mother called every Sunday, Daniel stopped by whenever he could, and no one told me to forgive, date again, or move on. They simply stayed beside me, reminding me that real support rarely needs words. By winter, the hallway where our wedding photographs had once hung no longer felt empty. It belonged to the life I was building, not the one I'd lost. Some memories still surfaced without warning: a familiar song, a favorite restaurant, or the brief instinct to text Ethan before remembering there was no reason to. The feeling passed quickly. It wasn't heartbreak anymore, only quiet sadness for the woman who had believed our future was permanent. What hurt most wasn't discovering the affair. It was wondering how much of our marriage had been real. Eventually, I accepted that some questions never receive answers, and chasing them only keeps old wounds alive. Nearly a year after the divorce, I unlocked the drawer in my office and found the manila folder that had once changed everything. The reports, photographs, and evidence that had kept me awake for weeks now felt strangely distant. I carried them to the shredder, not to erase the past, but because I no longer needed proof to justify leaving. As the last page disappeared, I remembered Ethan's ultimatum: sign the house over to me, or I'm leaving tonight. I thought I would panic, compromise, and give him what he wanted. Instead, he walked away carrying the suitcases he'd packed for a future that never happened, while I remained exactly where I belonged. Looking back now, I realize I never actually lost what mattered most. Today, I still own my home, still run the company I built from an old pickup truck and borrowed equipment, and I'm surrounded by people who value me instead of what they can take from me. The experience didn't make me stronger overnight. It made me wiser, quieter, and far more protective of my peace. Most of all, it taught me that dignity isn't something another person gives you. It's something you refuse to surrender. Sometimes I sit on my back patio at sunset, listening to the silence that once felt unbearable. Now it feels like freedom. People still ask whether I regret refusing Ethan's ultimatum. The answer has never changed. He believed that night I had to choose between my marriage and my house. In reality, I was choosing between losing myself and finding myself again. If I were standing in that living room again, facing the same ultimatum, I'd make the same choice every single time.